Well, Fred, we are back once again with Polanus, two guys talking on the internet. Polanus on Trinity, Axioms 12 through 13.
That's right. Good. We've come a long way. Good to see you again, Ryan.
It's great to see you too. It has been a lot, and we are facing, I think, something of a turning of the page or some conclusionary notes. What do you think Axiom 12 and 13 kind of are functioning in
Yeah.
these 18?
Yeah. He's only got 18 axioms. We're up to 12 and 13. And I think he's 12 and 13 repeat themselves a little bit. They're very short, but he's making some minor points. I think Polanus is pretty convinced he's done some of the major work. So we'll do a little recap here, I think, of how far he's come. Probably big picture down through Axiom 13. Polanus has shown us how to develop the doctrine of the Trinity. Let me just say, as a subset within the doctrine of the one God. I don't know if that's overstating it, but Polanus is definitely strongly committed to monotheism. You know, that this is the Christian doctrine of the one God who is three in person. So he's strongly committed to certain forms of teaching divine simplicity. But mainly he's doing this in such a way that, I mean, in a lot of 20th century theology, there was kind of some loose talk about, on the one hand, there's the doctrine of the one God, and then over here you get to the doctrine of the triune God. And of course, Polanus does have a lot to say in a previous volume about the divine essence and the divine attributes. And he covers all that in a general way, because all of that equally applies to all three of the divine persons.
Right. But Fred, that leads me to kind of think about a question that I know you thought a lot about with your work on Rahner, and we've mentioned it at various times here. Maybe just speaking really loosely, if the 20th century or Trinitarian theology closer to our own time is an emphasis on Trinity, maybe to a de-emphasizing of essence. I think we see Polanus is maybe a bit the other way, an emphasis on essence within which we do Trinity, as you said, a subset or something along those lines. What are maybe some of the real differences that are driving that sort of, I mean, you know, we'd like to expect good theologians are not just doing differing emphases, but they're principled differences and focuses and these sorts of things. And what are some of the dangers maybe on either side if we push too hard? You know, some people like to talk about the equal priority or the equal ultimacy of oneness or Trinity or these sorts of things. What are your thoughts on these sorts of issues?
Yeah, I mean, one would hope. You get the impression sometimes from academic theology that it is a little bit like fashion, you know, where in the fashion industry, things have to change because that's the nature of what things are going to do. Like
We
that was
have to
last
write a
season.
new dissertation. What
That's
is
right.
new?
Yeah. Sleeves were getting too long and billowy. This season, sleeves are going to be shorter. And that maybe is appropriate in something like high fashion, but one would hope that's not really what's going on in academic
It's
theology.
debatable. Yeah, going on.
Yeah, the impression is there. With serious theologians, though, you know, you wouldn't want to say that someone like Kate Sonderegger is just responding, you know,
Right.
to a change in fashion. She's actually a contemporary theologian who is seeing an overemphasis, you know, a direction of overemphasizing threeness to such an extent that you know, in academic theology, you're getting explicit statements against monotheism. That Christianity is not a monotheistic religion or something like that. And so, you know, Sonderegger is really trying to kind of move that needle back and appreciatively say, here's what we learned from this very salvation history-centered analysis of the three distinct persons and the quest to somehow get from those three distinct agents to some concept of the oneness of God, whatever that may be. Who knows, maybe it's a mystery. Sonderegger is coming back and saying, well, wait a minute. The way I read the Bible, the oneness of God is very clear. And then the distinction of Father, Son, and Spirit within that divine oneness doesn't go back and it doesn't say, you know, the oneness of God testified in the Old Testament witness. Just kidding. Actually, it turns out to be three.
Right. It's not
No,
it's not resolved into threeness in some sort of Hegelian fancy move or
exactly. Somehow you maintain that strong Old Testament monotheism, to speak loosely about it, the oneness of God, and the revelation of God as Father, Son, and Spirit happens within that.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you're going to teeter-totter, then of course you're going to want to be alert to not bottom out into some kind of modalism where you resolve the threeness into, no, it really was just one.
Mm-hmm.
And something like that is what people must mean when they talk about the equal ultimacy of oneness and threeness. Though that's kind of loose talk, right? There is something strange about these are both factors that have to be taken into account.
Yeah.
But when you look at the...
Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
Well, the Cappadocian, someone like Nazianzus is going to say, how many ultimate principles are there to be talked about? There is one. There's, monarche, one ultimate principle. Multiple principles, that's the plaything of the Greeks, and let them have it.
Yeah.
Right. No principles, that's anarchy. Yeah.
So uncomfortable with the language of equal ultimacy. And also, I think for principled reasons that maybe I'll leave to the side at the moment. But yeah, these sorts of ideas are not helpful. It's interesting you mentioned Kate Sonderegger. I'm finishing up a series of articles actually reflecting on her Doctrine of God project, both Essence and Trinity, and her 2 volumes on systematics. And in the first volume, she makes a statement, quoting from memory, something to the effect of, it's intensely difficult to maintain the oneness of God in the field that Barth and Rahner have made. And I think I found that comment very, very fascinating. So you are right. She is definitely responding. And a lot of the 20th century theology among Orthodox people, so we're not talking, I don't want to name names, I suppose, and automatically cast them into non-Orthodox people, but we're not talking necessarily about this incredibly God in time sort of approach, but we're talking about someone like a Barth or a Rahner, who are both very sensitive to the transcendence of God, and yet are still exalting Trinity in an effort, as Rahner says, to Christianize the divine essence, as he says in his whole book on Trinity.
Yeah. So a lot going on. I think Kate Sonderegger's work, where does it fall? Somewhere between the sort of Barth and Rahner, trying to do dogmatics or very traditional theology. On the other hand, you'd have someone like, I think, Moltmann and Jensen. If you told them they weren't towing the line of orthodoxy, they would say, thank you, that's not an insult, that's a very perceptive reading. We've explicitly said we're being revisionist. I don't say that to dismiss them. I think that's an accurate reading of their own self-understanding. Sonderegger's probably somewhere in the middle. She's doing this enormously creative, she's doing like set theory and like what is, it's just really interesting stuff. But definitely trying to pull back in the direction of divine oneness.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's look at Axioms 12 and 13. Axiom 12, very short. Relations which are proper to the persons do not compose but only distinguish. So to put this in a more Augustinian way, you can talk about God according to essence or according to relation. And sort of the problem, it's at least the problematic that Trinitarian theology is trying to work with here, is you can talk about God according to the divine essence all day long and never say anything that distinguishes the persons. If you're going to distinguish the persons from one another, you're going to have to talk relationally. Which means if you try to sort of pin down the Son and say something that's only about him, anything you say about his essence is going to feed right into the oneness of God. So you're going to have to bring in the Father, and at least implicitly the Spirit, though conceptually you can set that to one side while you're trying to work out the Father-Son relation. And then you're going to say something relationally about the Son that invokes the relational reality of the Father. And that's what's going to enable you to sort of pick out the Son.
Right. Right. But in doing that, we are never introducing composition into God in all of the sorts of ways that composition might obtain, or we might think it would obtain, given the fact that we are adding concepts or sticking things in persons like relations or what have you, or having now multiple persons, three to be precise. None of this introduces composition in the technical metaphysical sense. So this is composition, involves usually a series of claims in metaphysics, not all of which are going to be agreed upon, but roughly speaking, here, things that are composed are going to be really distinct for one. Yeah. One is going to be an act and one is going to be a potency for another. These sorts of elements, right. Usually there's 3 or 4, but those are especially too basic. And
well, let me ask this sort of at the sentence level in Axiom 12. Relations don't compose. How should I complete this sentence? Is this an incomplete ellipsis? Relations don't compose the persons, or relations don't compose God?
I think here my suspicion is he's talking about they do not compose with the persons. So something, if you're not careful, you might forget, but it's really important to recall that the divine simplicity is always operative in resolving the rational distinctions that we've made. At any point in God, we're always, as it were, smushing back together and making a claim that the what is signified by our diverse concepts, and the diverse concepts themselves seem to suggest diversity within the thing that's signified. Actually, the thing that's signified is absolutely one. So if you take the Father, and here we add on his relation, and here we add on his notional act, and here we have the act of spiration, besides the act of principling the Son, and these sorts of things. You also have to use the tool of simplicity, resolve all of those into one who just is the Father, who just is God. So I think, like last time we talked about resolving the relations into the essence, we also have to resolve the relations into the persons, because relations among creatures are going to be accidents that come and go and happen, and also creatures that gain them undergo change and these sorts of things. And that's not the case when it comes to talk of God. So it's specifically resolving all the things about the persons into just being identically that person himself, really.
Yeah, okay. So there is a sense in which I mentally compose my idea of the Son by saying, like step 1, think about God. Okay, so now step 2, think about God filially. That is to say, think about God relationally as the one who is from the Father.
Right.
I have composed the concept of the Son, the person of the Son that I'm working with. Obviously, and I think Polanus puts it that way in one of the earlier axioms that we've looked at, that you put together the idea of a person of the Trinity by combining the idea of God and the idea of a relation.
Right.
So he's not ruling that out.
Mm-hmm.
But he is saying that when you make that move, what you're doing is distinguishing Father from Son from Spirit. You're distinguishing, or you're distinguishing person from essence, which is a different kind of distinction, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. All right, so that's Axiom 12. I mean, it's one of the shortest. He's just, it's as if he looks back on what he's done in 1 through 11 and says, by the way, remember, at no point here are we introducing composition into God, or even into a person, because you could go either way with that. Right.
Anything, and again, this is just an application of the Council of Florence, 1439, in Deo omnia sunt unum, ubi non obvia relationes oppositio. In God, all things are absolutely one, simply God himself, where a real opposed relation does not obtain. So at the place of real opposed relation, if you're not at that place, everything is absolutely simply one, including all the properties that occur within a person. And
yeah,
it's just an application of that rule.
Yeah. Now, before we go on to Axiom 13, is in the literature on the Trinity that you get in the late Middle Ages and on through the Reformation period, is there a distinction? Is there a difference between talking about composing the persons and distinguishing the persons? It's curious. It's curious that in this zone, and some of the reading that you do in medieval and early modern Trinitarian theology, this is not a disputed territory between Protestants and Catholics, right? If you were reading widely in soteriology, it'd be a whole different arena. But actually, treatises on God, there's kind of an ecumenical, ongoing consensus here.
Yeah, this is 100% in common with all theologians of the Latin West, period. Yeah. There's no theologian who says that there is a real composition that obtains in God in any way, no matter what. But we must, again, as you mentioned earlier, you can't collapse into modalism. What prevents a modalism? You have to assert that there is really a distinction. It's all you have to do. It's very small. The requirement is extremely small. And keep in mind, again, that requirement is simply the rational distinction that we make in our head has a correspondence in God, and therefore is not merely rational, but is real. It's not going to be any different for us in our experience of thinking about God. We're going to be making rational distinctions all day long. But at certain points we say, here, this rational distinction has a correspondent value, as it were, or it pings in God, and therefore it's true and real, really distinct in God, and therefore we're not modalist. That rests on, of course, special revelation.
Okay. He distinguishes here, he makes a difference between composing and distinguishing. Is the word constitute, would that be different in this discussion as a technical term?
It would be. So constituting is the place. So there are several things that really distinguish persons from each other. Their notional acts, whether they have a procession or no, their relations, the relations of origin, these sorts of things. Only one of those things that really distinguishes them is going to be allowed to actually constitute or make that divine person. And again, we're using make in the sense that our making in our head has a correspondent already made thing in God, such that what we make is true and again corresponds to what is in God. And it's at that point that we say this is where the person is. For Polanus, that place of individualizing or individuation is the real opposed relation, as we covered in the last axioms. So we have compose, distinguish, constitute. Constitute and distinguish are good. Composing, very bad. Don't do that. Very bad.
Okay. Yeah, and compose and constitute just sound pretty similar in normal spoken English. But if we're speaking precisely, constitute can continue to be a good word because it can reflect the kind of constructive thinking, adding concepts to concepts that we're talking about. Constituting. Okay, good. Axiom 13. The divine persons are distinct but not separated. Separated would be like three men are separated in actual reality, even though they are one in species. So distinct but not separated is, this is pretty straightforward. I think I mentioned earlier that when people are just beginning to talk about the Trinity and they say the Father and the Son are different, I'll usually let it pass depending on what level of technical we're talking. But you don't get too many minutes down the line of thinking about this before you want to say, actually, I probably shouldn't say they're different. I think I need to say they're distinct because different brings a lot of baggage with it. And distinct is going to help me more. Here he uses, though, distinct as opposed to separate. And actually, I will hear people say sometimes, the Father and Son are totally different, separate persons or people even. And I'll say, well, I'm pretty sure you never want to use the word separate because you never get one without the other. They are relationally distinguished at every point.
Right. They're together, they're together, and their togetherness or their oneness is that absolute oneness of the divine essence. Maybe another word for separated here, I mean, it is just separated in Latin, but maybe something like severed off from. So I think like in common English, separated, we're not too uncomfortable with, but if you ask them, well, are they severed off from one another or like isolated and these sorts of like weird things, then people start to see, at least in my experience, oh yeah, this is not what we want to be thinking. No, this is not correct.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. All I really meant was I can think about the Father for a minute.
Right.
And not explicitly be thinking about the Son. But the pressure to, because he's only the Father if there's a Son. And so the pressure is always going to be there to recognize their togetherness.
Right. And this is just a really fascinating comment to me. Yeah. And I think it has a lot to say to our social Trinitarian brethren who are leaning in that direction. It's so hard not to think of the Trinity of persons as three guys hanging out up there, to be blunt. I like to think of it, all the pictures and images, regardless of what your stance is on images of the Trinity, but they always picture three guys up there. And it's like, oh man, well, this is actually really difficult not to think about. And especially when you have a situation like this, where Polanus says they are one in species. And what he means by that is just like you and I are one in species, we have the same species of humanity, even though we're individualized. We had a third guy up here, we would be together one in species. And same with the persons of the Trinity. They are each one, they have the same essence. Species is being used here very, very loosely because species is comprised of genus and difference. And of course, these are going to be really distinct and therefore composed. And so species is, again, being used more metaphorically here, but it's rather interesting to see this sort of idea being expressed. And
yeah, let me ask you again about species there. I understand I should think loosely about this because species has such a technical possible meaning in like medieval philosophy of mind and Aristotle and that kind of stuff. The agent intellect and the, abstracting the species. Polanus is not invoking that kind of conversation here. We have an opposite problem in the target language here, where species in English sounds like part of biological taxonomy, right? Like a kingdom, genus, species.
I do think that's probably quite close to what the technical usage of species is here.
So something like we're human and not canine, and so what we have in common is the species of humanity. We are one in that, but we are separate in actual reality.
Yeah. And our species, a human is defined in at least those who are of an Aristotelian sort, and this is basically everyone, at least to this degree, up till 17th, 18th century, if not much farther. But a human being is a rational animal, and so animal, which is not what we mean by animal here today in English. It has a very technical conceptual overtone to it. But animal, we share in common with all living things that are animals, not plants, but they have a certain type of soul, as it were. But then we add to that a difference that makes us different than our dogs and our cats and these sorts of things. And that's our rationality, the fact that our soul is intellectual. And you put those together, and that is what defines what a man is. And so whenever we're talking about species in these sorts of terms, it's not, as you pointed out well, like the intelligible species that people use in philosophy of mind. Thomas is famous for that. But it's the species that is comprised of a genus plus a difference that are really composed together to make a type of thing. It means a type of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, good. And I think even thinking about the difference between persons and people in normal non-technical English, I think it really matters that when we talk about the persons of the Trinity, even in a non-technical, English way of speaking theologically, we say three persons and not three people.
Interesting.
Because I think people just intuitively, English speakers just intuitively pick up on this sense that, well, three people is too far. Even if, when you drill down, they're pretty social Trinitarian, and they would say like centers of consciousness and centers of willing and stuff, they still don't want to call them people, because it just seems to go too far in the direction of univocally talking about what there's three of in God and what there's two of in this conversation. I mean, I would even say no one says persons in modern English except the fire marshal, who's posting signs, not to be occupied by more than 50 persons. It's kind of archaic sounding when you get it in those public warnings. Or in Trinitarian theology, even at the popular non-technical level, we continue to say persons.
Right, and that's a great thing to call attention to, of how technical the terminology of person actually is. And, a lot of 20th century theology is very uncomfortable with the use of person in its various English or German equivalents, especially English and German, because the definition of person is so vastly different than the classical usage, especially in Trinitarian or in Christological theology. But here it just means anytime you have an individual and that individual is possessed of an intellectual nature. So whether that's rational or merely intellectual like angels, or the intellectual nature of God, if you have an individual having any one of those natures, you have a person. And that's the definition in use here. But it's very different than what we often think of today. We think of, ability to express autonomy, and autonomy is very central. Dominus sui, the Lord of oneself, is one of the shortest, most classical definitions that Thomas has of a person. But yeah, this, subjectivity, all these sorts of things that, we want to be careful with those terms. Yeah,
I guess as long as we're on this three men separated in actual reality kind of, what is it? It's like an analogy that Polanus is saying it's a bad one. Like, this is not what it's like. I guess if you and I have a common humanity, we both instantiate the species of humanity. That's, if I perish, then not much has happened to the species of humanity, because I'm just one of the instances of it, and there are lots like me.
Neither one of us are humanity.
Right. Yeah. Whereas each of the persons of the Trinity, I mean, would you say each of them is the entire species of divinity?
Right. Now we're seeing where species is really inadequate, but yeah,
which is why he doesn't use it on the divine side like I just did.
Right. Each of them is the divine nature. For sure.
Right. So if, per impossible, something happened to one of the persons of the Trinity, it would have to take out the entire divine nature with it.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And Thomas is Thomas has this fantastic quote where he says, if you lose the real opposed relation that constitutes person, you take it away, you have nothing that's left. Not only the person, but also the essence of God. So this is how unified it is. Again, we're distributing simplicity upon the question of the inhabitation of the relation of the divine essence. And absolutely right. If you take it away, all of God is gone.
Right. So this is something that I really appreciate in Polanus and the whole way of thinking that he uses. There's kind of an order of operations where the really big picture stuff is in place and secure, and then he works down through all the necessary implications. I don't mean he works down deductively, but as he takes up the biblical information, he comes to something like the death of Christ on the cross, and he doesn't think, wow, I have to restart everything from here and just pretend I know nothing and start my theology from the cross. He actually thinks, well, obviously the cross is the point we've been coming to all along, but I don't restart all my theology. I don't pretend Genesis never happened, or, Exodus was going to get a do-over or something. So by the time he gets to something like the death of Christ on the cross, he's able to think, order of operations, what do we know about the divine being? What do you know about the divine persons? Okay, now take with full seriousness what happens on the cross.
Right.
When someone comes at this from the other direction and doesn't have their order of operations established, and they think, okay, so Jesus died on the cross and Jesus is God, so God died, but like part of God or something. That's where you have to stop them and say, if, per impossible, if in fact the Son died in the sense that he stopped being, he stopped being.
According to his human nature.
Yeah. But if he died according to his divine nature, you kind of got no options. There's actually no such thing as God if that were the case.
For sure.
And it's hard for people they'll sort of flirt with that conclusion, like, I know, right? Scary, right? But if you actually hold them down to it, you say, are you really, was there really are you a Holy Saturday atheist? Like there's actually no God at that point? Very few people are willing to go that route with it.
You mean we don't have the crucified God, Fred? We don't have the crucified.
Yeah. And I think I view that as an order of operations issue, where you start from the wrong end. You don't have a doctrine of God in place. Yeah.
For sure. And I like that as a phrase. The order of operations is not just an instance of good pedagogy, or here's a helpful way of, we start with 1 and then go to 3 because 1 is simpler than 3 or something like that.
Oh, right.
Not at all. This is really structured. The order is one way. It's definite. It's determined. And this is, at least in my opinion, the only way that you can take to be orthodox. Otherwise, you're really setting yourself up for a lot of hard work to stay orthodox, because you're really slipping.
Yeah. There are mottos, theological mottos, like let's start with Jesus, start theology with Jesus. And in themselves, they're sort of inspirational and motivational, and I can get behind them, as long as when you start theology with Jesus, you acknowledge the gigantic amount of theology that Jesus presupposes, right? Like there's pretty good evidence he was familiar with Moses and the Psalms and Isaiah, right? So all of that theology is what you implicitly take on board when you start theology from Jesus.
For sure. I think that's great.
All right. Well, that's Axioms 12 and 13. Let me just say here, by way of preview of where we're going next, is Axiom 14, which is just massive. The 18 axioms are only about 6,000 words long, and that's in the English translation, and about 3,000 of them are all in Axiom 14. So it's got it's going to be several episodes. Axiom 14 is as big as the rest of them put together. And
it is packed with, I don't know why he did not separate it out, because there's so many different topics, as we'll see.
Yeah.
So you and your teacher inclinations with your red pen will have to be really busy at correcting. Yeah, it's crazy.
So there's a kind of provisional stopping point here, in that he's rehearsed in the first 13 axioms sort of as much as he thinks he needs to rehearse to sort of set things up for the large discussion he's about to give us in the next one.
That's right. Good. All right. Well, I'm going to look forward to that next time, Fred, and it's great talking to you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Good to see you again, Ryan.